Um, Now, those of you who've managed to turn up to the last few lunchtime talks, who are at the book launch maybe, or have even seen the catalogue, will know that three little-known artists, John Cleveley and the brothers John, Frederick, and James Miller, feature quite prominently throughout the show, and they will do in the exhibition itself when it goes online, hopefully later this month. Now, Cleveley and the Miller brothers were part of Joseph Banks' extensive entourage on a voyage of 1772 to Iceland, and which also took in short tours of the Inner Hebrides along the way and the Orkneys on the return. And their drawings feature in sections of Old Ways, New Roads, looking at travellers' interest in antiquities and natural history, as well as custom and improvement. Indeed, the concerns of Banks and his party of philosophical explorers, as they called themselves, were of considerable breadth, and the places and peoples they encountered or appreciated or read were understood in various ways. They were both the objects of aesthetic apprehension as well as terrains of intellectual and historical inquiry. Now, wonderfully, you can fully appreciate the scope of their work as all four folios of drawings, which include studies made in Iceland as well as the Scottish Islands, and also things done on the spot as well as much later in London on their return, have all been made available just recently online through the British Library's digitised manuscripts collection. And in the chat box, I've posted a link where you can click on and see all of these wonderful images, which is just fabulous to have them out there. For a long time, they were not reproduced anywhere or widely known. So it's fantastic that hopefully this might stimulate some more work on them. Now, it's beyond the scope of a 10 or 15-minute talk to do any kind of justice to this wealth of material. So what I want to briefly consider today is why this rich archive was produced in the first place, why Banks was so concerned to ensure that his travels were documented visually. That is, I want to try to say something about the function of drawing and visual images more generally on Banks's travels, and to offer up a few thoughts about the idea of the artist as an eyewitness. Now, we can trace the origins of Banks's Iceland voyage, which took in the Western Isles and the Orkneys, to plans he had for a, quote, northern journey for the benefit of natural history, to Lapland, which he proposed back in early 1768. Looking forward to receiving a, quote, particular account of some of the wonderful scenes which are mentioned in the oration of the great Carl Linnaeus. In a letter of February 1768, Banks's friend William Faulkner was to recommend that he, quote, take a designer with you, so it would be easier to sketch out some of the views that he might encounter. And then your designer might stain his drawing and point out the colour of the soil and the verdure with the nature of the rocks, and enable us here to have a fuller idea of the country which no description possibly can. Now, the idea of heading north was abandoned a few months after this letter, when Banks found himself going the other way, travelling south towards the Pacific with Captain James Cook on the Endeavour voyage, the expedition that secured the naturalist's fame. And although it subsequently became known as Cook's first voyage, at the time it was very much celebrated as Banks's achievement. Now, while the voyage to Lapland didn't take place, Banks did heed Falconer's advice, employing two Scots, Alexander Buchan and Sidney Parkinson, to make drawings of local flora and fauna in the Pacific. Indeed, Falconer's letter has been understood as establishing an agenda for the illustration of natural history on voyages of exploration more generally. Specifically, Falconer's faith in the ability of visual images to provide a fuller idea of the country than any written description would allow was to be echoed throughout the accounts of Cook's epic voyages. A belief, however, in the clarity afforded by images extended well beyond the visual archive documenting the findings and experiences of Pacific voyages, coming to determine the place of draftsmanship in antiquarian circles, military and maritime cultures, as well as various branches of natural history. Indeed, many of the images in Old Ways, New Roads, I think, are born of this kind of belief, as it were, in uh, the ability of visual images to communicate in a way which was not necessarily reducible to language. While academic theorists advocated a kind of generalizing or ideal art, which was at odds with such a conviction, and others remained suspicious of the powers of illusion, Falconer was far from alone in being assured that artists had an invaluable role to play in the collation and summary of knowledge. In his Anecdotes of British Topography of 1768, Richard Gough declared that, quote, the pencil is as essential as the pen to illustrate antiquities. Like Banks and others, Gough saw visual data as a way of assembling what history and geography had scattered, so enabling their fuller comprehension. When preparing to accompany Cook on a second voyage to the South Seas in 1772, Banks engaged no less than 4 artists: the Royal Academician Johann Zoffany, Cleveley, and the Miller brothers. But on Banks falling out with the Admiralty over the accommodation on board Cook's ship Resolution, he revisited his idea of the Northern Journey, at least in part as a way of employing the party of philosophical explorers he had assembled, Cleveley and the Millers included. In this, it's kind of worth noting that the voyage, the whole journey, was something of a kind of thrown together ad hoc adventure, as it were. You know, the plan was much grander. It was to go to the Pacific. And so this is very much a kind of fallback, something to keep people employed, something to still engage people philosophically, as it were. And it perhaps, in a lunchtime talk a couple of weeks ago, Mungo Campbell talking about these images of that were done in the Western Isles, but on the Banks voyage, made the point that he goes to quite safe places, as it were, more or less, off Scotland. And I think maybe that was the product of this whole voyage, as it were, being quite an ad hoc experience, not particularly detailed in the planning. Now, when we look at the drawings produced by Cleveley and the Millers, both on the voyage and more particularly after it, such as these very highly worked up, finished images that you see on the screen here, they're remarkably versatile. The artists have been asked to address a startling range of subjects over the course of the 4-month journey that they found themselves on. Their work taking in kind of sweeping, wide-angled views of distant shorelines in the tradition of coastal profiling, a maritime form of draftsmanship, as well as intimate genre-like depictions of native communities and studies of local antiquities. So, for instance, you have this kind of strange genre-like scene of the inside of the Weaver's House by Frederick Miller, a well-known image here, which in some ways, for instance, resembles nothing so much as the kind of candlelight interiors of the contemporary painter Joseph Wright of Derby, or things like Miller's detailed antiquarian study, for instance, of the cross of the Oronsay monastery that Mungo talked with you about a couple of weeks back. So there, in other words, they're being asked to address an incredibly diverse range of materials here and studies, and different kinds of landscapes, many of them extremely challenging, outside, as it were, or beyond um, conventional landscape art of the period. I mean, this is most obviously the case, for instance, if you click on the link to the British Library folios and flick ahead to the volume on Iceland, where they're faced with an utterly alien landscape. The closest here, of course, is the startling views of the basalt columns of the volcanic island of Staffa that you can see at top right there. Now, at this point, it seems kind of appropriate. In a way, I thought about doing this talk today just around this one detail of this one image. To think about an artist sketching outdoors in the period, to think about them sketching in situ. Here we see a detail of Cleveley's stretching view along the western shoreline of Islay in the direction of the small but then expanding settlement of Bowmore. And it's worth thinking here about some of the physical difficulties actually of sketching outdoors, particularly on somewhere like Staffa, this kind of blasted kind of rock, as it were, small black island with no trees, no cover in the middle of the seas. If anyone's ever been to Staffa, you'll know what a kind of overwhelming kind of physical experience that is. So there are physical difficulties of sketching out, of being an artist eyewitness, as it were, to think about here too. But turning more to think about the image of the artist sketching in a drawing like this, then we might take the seated figure here, accompanied by the plaid-clad local resident, who perhaps guides the draftsman's eye to features of interest, as one of the Miller brothers, or else a self-portrait of Cleveley himself. Now, such figures gazing out over the adjacent country from some foreground, high ground or promontory feature again and again in the landscape art of the 18th century. Another example here, chosen almost at random, is this detail from one of Charles Stewart's fabulous paintings for the Blair Atholl dining room. Here, a view here of the Cascades out near Blair, but showing probably not the artist actually here, but actually his patron, the fourth Duke of Atholl, out sketching, accompanied again here, interestingly, by another kind of plaid-clad local figure, directing your gaze out to the landscape. Now, the presence of such figures in art like this serves much the same purpose, perhaps, as the inscription found on many a drawing or print of the period, which claims that it was, quote, taken on the spot. It designates this as a view of a particular place. But like other framing elements used to guide the eye, such as a decorative tree or a fragment of architecture, the inclusion of a figure sketching also works to confer it with a kind of scenic status, to say this stretch of land is worthy of being thought picturesque, to say it is like a picture. It can be transformed into a picture, into a landscape. Now, to suggest, for instance, that the landscapes of the Inner Hebrides was worthy of being of scenic interest was a relatively novel idea at this moment in the early 1770s. So what I think a figure like that in Cleveley's view towards Bowmore also points up is a certain self-consciousness, as it were, about acts of observation and depiction, and their role in constructing the landscape, in giving this place encountered meaning, to see it as in somehow some degree of significance. Now, other figures appear in the drawings made by Cleveley and the Millers too, especially those kinds of highly finished drawings, which I think were probably being made with the idea that they would be eventually translated into print to accompany an official account of the voyage, which of course for various reasons never materializes. But in these images we have figures, examining antiquities, or as here, scrambling over stones, or shooting, or making observations in other ways, animating the scenes in some way, but also contributing, as with the image of the artist as eyewitness, to the immediacy and the plausibility of the pictorial account. I think also that their appearance and then their reappearance across scenes, if you go again to the folios up on the British Library website and you go through the images, you begin to see that these figures kind of reoccur, as it were, and they become, and it implies a sense of kind of seriality to the images, that they are meant to be seen in sequence and that they relate to each other, and that there are narrative elements both within individual images but also through them, as it were. And so the whole visual archive of the voyage becomes like an unfolding narrative, an unfolding sequence which tracks the movements of the voyage, as it were, but also relates sort of passage encounters, incidents, and little sort of plots, as it were. Now, as I say, I think that most of these images were produced probably with the idea of being made into plates, engraved plates to accompany an account of the voyage. Now, as I say, that doesn't materialize for various reasons. However, some of these plates, as many of you will know, famously end up illustrating Thomas Pennant's tour of Scotland and the Hebrides of 1772. Pennant himself couldn't travel out to Stafford, but famously used Banks's description of the island and, of course, most importantly, the artist's drawings to illustrate his account. Now, we can see this sense of, therefore, these images as providing a kind of unfolding sequence, a narrative, as it were, in the way that they appear in Pennant's tour of Scotland of 1772. They take you from these kinds of broad, wide-angled views of the island seen at a distance as you approach it, down through and into close views of Stafford, views into Fingal's Cave, or views out over, for instance, Bouchala. So there's a sense of sequential movement around it, providing you with different kind of views, as it were, of perspectives on the island, conveying therefore very much a sense of movement around it through this use of changing viewpoints, but also maybe also the actions of the figures. Now, it's worth remembering, of course, in this, that these prints, as they appeared in Pennant's tour, are, of course, at several removes, as it were, from the original on-the-spot sketches made in such difficult conditions on the island of Staffa. One of, again, the wonderful things, as it were, about the collection of Banks drawings of this voyage in the British Library is that you can trace this process. You can trace them from these original faint pencil sketches to more worked up ink drawings, sometimes just pencil outlines or the pen outlines, such as the one you see on top right there, to more finished watercolor studies, such as the one on the bottom left, to the final print as it appears in Pennant's book. So this idea, for instance, that these images, of course, take you closer to or provide some kind of straightforward encounter, as it were, with this landscape, this place as it was, as it were, is at several moves. My point, I suppose, in all this, if I have one, is to suggest that a sort of strange contradiction, as it were. That is that the methods and motifs which are employed in images like this, the inclusion of the figures, for instance, the sketching man, are meant to imply an eyewitness status for the artist, which is then also, of course, undercuts the apparent transparency of the image. This is not, of course, in any way a kind of straightforward matter of fact image in any sense. It's filtered through convention, it's filtered through memory. These are things made long way from the motif, sometimes not in this particular instance, but in other instances, 2 or 3 years after the actual encounter with these landscapes. So there's a product very much of imagination as well as observation, where these, enlivened, as it were, by these figures and other included narrative elements as well. I'm going to kind of stop there. I'm aware that